Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I'm reading you a book. We are reading Pride and Prejudice for Jane Austen July 2024, although obviously, since wild horses couldn't keep us all from doing the whole of this book, we will be extending beyond July. And we have been watching a little drama unfold at Netherfield Hall. Jane Bennet has been sick with a cold. She's not at death's doorstep. Her sister Elizabeth has been taking care of her. Her hosts, Mr. Bingley and his sisters, and sister's husband, and Mr. Darcy, have been very solicitous. They haven't been very nice when she's out of earshot, but they've been very solicitous. And also, Jane's mother has come over for a visit to ascertain how things were. And Jane wants to go home, but Mrs. Bennet won't hear of it. And neither will there's no doctor here in the situation. There's the local apothecary, which several writers in Jane Austen's day and later said was basically the same thing as calling an undertaker, because they were certainly going to make you worse. But in this case, Jane is a healthy young woman who just has a mild cold, so the apothecary can't do much damage. But he also says that she shouldn't think of moving herself until she's better than she is now. Which means that Elizabeth is thrown on the hospitality of the Netherfield party. And we have seen a couple of different instances in her stay, her inadvertent stay. Keep in mind, none of this is the kind of conniving that Mrs. Bennet is maligned for by the narrator of Pride and Prejudice. And maybe Mrs. Bennet is guilty of that conniving to a certain extent. But Jane was answering an enthusiastic, fun, playful invitation from the Bingley women to go and visit them because we're at each other's throat. We need our friend to come and separate us or we're going to kill each other. That's a fun, friendly invitation. That wasn't finagled out of them by any kind of artistry whatsoever. Jane accepts it without thinking really about Mr. Bingley. She thinks instead about these new friends that she's made. She goes, okay, there may have been a little conniving on Mrs. Bennet's part in sending her on a horse instead of in a carriage. But really that's because there was a storm in the offing, and Mrs. Bennet was probably thinking if she takes the horse, they'll stable it at Netherfield Hall, and she'll be stuck there while the weather is bad. She probably wasn't thinking about Jane being caught in the rain. That happens, but I don't know that can be 100% laid at Mrs. Bennet's door, even though Mr. Bennet seems to imply that it can be. And also, Elizabeth going to Netherfield Hall is not conniving at all. She's not thinking about Mr. Darcy, even though we've been told a couple of times that he is now increasingly thinking of her. She's thinking only of her sister, and really has no use for Mr. Darcy. So that's where we are now, in chapter 12, which is very short. And the sisters, Jane is well enough to travel. She's well enough to go down and sit by the fire. She's probably well enough to go 3 miles in a carriage. But that's where we are now. And the whole question now for chapter 12 is, when are Jane and Elizabeth going to leave Netherfield Hall? When are they going to go home? That's the whole question. In consequence of an agreement between the sisters, Elizabeth wrote the next morning to her mother to beg that the carriage might be sent for them in the course of the day. But Mrs. Bennet, who had calculated on her daughters remaining at Netherfield till the following Tuesday, which would exactly finish Jane's week, could not bring herself to receive them with pleasure before. Let's keep going. Her answer, therefore, was not propitious, at least not to Elizabeth's wishes, for she was impatient to get home. Mrs. Bennet sent them word that they could not possibly have the carriage before Tuesday, and in her postscript it was added that if Mr. Bingley and his sister pressed them to stay longer, she could spare them very well. Against staying longer, however, Elizabeth was positively resolved. Nor did she much expect that it would be asked, and fearful, on the contrary, as being considered as intruding themselves needlessly long, she urged Jane to borrow Mr. Bingley's carriage immediately, and at length it was settled that their original design of leaving Netherfield that morning should be mentioned, and the request made. So sending home for the Bennet family carriage is not the only option. Of course, Bingley has a carriage of his own. But Mrs. Bennet wants her to stay longer. And you can read into that the narrator's unceasing hatred of Mrs. Bennet. I don't care how awkward it is socially for you, the longer she's at Netherfield, the better. Because the longer she's at Netherfield, the better chance she has of Mr. Bingley falling in love with her, and then I have one less daughter to worry about. Uh, the communication excited many professions of concern, and enough was said of wishing them to stay at least till the following day to work on Jane, and till the morrow their going was deferred. Miss Bingley was then sorry that she had proposed the delay, for her jealousy and dislike of one sister much exceeded her affection for the other. That means she very much likes Jane, but she has conceived that she has reason to be jealous of Elizabeth, because Darcy can't take his eyes off her. The master of the house, that's Mr. Bingley, heard with real sorrow that they were to go soon, and repeatedly tried to persuade Miss Bennet that it would not be safe for her, that she was not enough recovered. But Jane was firm that she felt herself to be right. To Mr. Darcy it was welcome intelligence. Elizabeth had been at Netherfield long enough. She attracted him more than he liked, and Miss Bingley was uncivil to her and more teasing than usual to himself. He wisely resolved to be particularly careful that no sign of admiration should now escape him, nothing that could elevate her with the hope of influencing his felicity. What a prig. Sensible that if such an idea had been suggested, his behavior during the last day must have material weight in confirming or crushing it. Steady to his purpose, he scarcely spoke 10 words to her throughout the whole of Saturday, and though they were alone at one time, left by themselves for half an hour, he adhered most conscientiously to his book and would not even look at her. Imagine, knowing what we know of what's coming, that there's a whole afternoon where Elizabeth Bennet and Darcy are in the same room, not even speaking to each other. Amazing. On Sunday, after morning service, the separation, so agreeable to almost all, took place. Miss Bingley's civility to Elizabeth increased, at last, very rapidly, and as well as her affection for Jane. And when they parted, after assuring the latter of the pleasure it would always give her to see either at Longbourn or at Netherfield, and embracing her most tenderly, she even shook hands with the former. Elizabeth took leave of the whole party in the liveliest of spirits. They were not welcomed home very cordially by their mother. Mrs. Bennet wondered at their coming, and thought them very wrong to give so much trouble, and was sure Jane would have caught cold again. But their father, though very laconic in his expression of pleasure, was really glad to see them. He had felt their importance in the family circle. The evening's conversation, when they were all assembled, had lost much of its animation, and almost all of its sense, by the absence of Jane and Elizabeth. Can you imagine? It's all the two younger girls chattering on and on about officers. They found Mary. Oh, it's nice to have Mary mentioned. Our bookish Mary. It's nice to have her mentioned. They found Mary, as usual, deep in the study of thorough base and human nature, and had some new extracts to admire, and some new observations of threadbare morality to listen to. Catherine and Lydia had information for them on a different sort. Much had been done, and much had been said in the regiment since the preceding Wednesday. Several of the officers had dined lately with their uncle, a private had been flogged, and it had actually been hinted that Colonel Foster was going to be married. The girls are all gaga about a visiting regiment. That's all they can think about. And Jane and Elizabeth get home. Bingley gives them his carriage. They get home. Mrs. Bennet is not happy. We don't hear any dialogue to that effect. Their father is pleased to see them back. We don't get any dialogue to that effect. They catch up with their sisters, either Mary and her book Larnin, or Catherine and Lydia and their incredible fangirling about the local regiment. And boom, that's it. That's the chapter. That's how it stops. We don't get a word of anything. We don't get any standard Jane Austen observations other than one that was extremely shop-worn 2,000 years before she wrote this chapter, which is that guests are like fish. They're fresh for 3 days, and after that they stink. Now, that is not true here at Hyde Cottage. If I like you, if you're not a guest here because of circumstance or convenience or pro forma or other, in other words, if I invite you from the heart, I want you to stay forever. I want you to stay forever. I want to take your room downstairs and just stay forever. But usually in social circumstances, especially in a case like this where the only two people who are really ripped up about any of this are Jane and Mr. Bingley. They're the only ones who don't want to part. Everyone else is happy for this to happen for one reason or another. Everyone else is happy for the separation to happen. But that's the chapter. Jane Austen just tells us there was a fuss about when the girls would go home, and they resolved it. And that's it. That's it. That's the chapter. There's not much to it. It has no dialogue. It has no real insights. It repeats the narrator's warning, the narrator's observation to us that Darcy is now aware of a danger to his own affections. He is starting to fall in love with Elizabeth, and the unspoken counterweight to that is that he cannot fall in love with her, that is totally unacceptable, would be totally unacceptable, because he's a gentleman, as we're going to hear much later on in the book, because he's a gentleman. Well, my father is a gentleman. Ah, yes, but who is your mother? Anyway, we're not talking yet about my favorite character in the book. She hasn't appeared yet, so we'll move on. The girls are back home. Jane is recovered. This whole little tempest in a teapot is over. The two things that are hanging over the book so far, now that little plot tangle is over, now that Jane is better at home, so they're not at Netherfield anymore, there are no evenings of fencing wits or anything like that. Now there are two things hovering over the story, and they are just little wisps in the air. Jane Austen is going to pluck at them to use them. One thing is that Bingley has promised to throw a ball at Netherfield Hall, a big to-do. And the second thing is the officers. The regiment is in town, and Catherine and Lydia can't shut up about them. And they're more and more in their social circles. They're sharing more and more of the social circles in and around Meryton. So the girls are going to meet them more and more, get to know them more and more. They're in the neighborhood now, and they weren't when the book started. So those are two things, but they aren't in this chapter. This chapter, God knows why it's here. I don't know why it's here, but here it is. So we'll wrap this up for now. We'll go on to a longer chapter next time, and I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.